Hello and welcome, my lovely psychology students, to another video for the Issues and Debates module. This one we're going to be looking at the debate. So this is our first debate that we're looking at, and this debate focuses on free will versus determinism. Nice little link to the spec link. It is good to become, I know I say this all the time, familiar with the spec link, because if it's listed in the spec link, that means they can ask a direct question on it in the exam. Rather than just a general question, they can ask specific questions. For example, define what is meant by hard determinism. So it's really important that you become familiar with the spec. So yes, we're going to be looking at hard, soft, biological, psychic, and environmental determinism. We're going to look at the debate of free will and also the scientific evidence on the causal relationship. Please, it doesn't say casual, it says causal. Causal means cause and effect. So let's make a start. Now, when it comes to the free will and determinism debate, it is something that will always be argued. The free will and determinism debate is concerned with whether or not behavior is freely produced or whether it is caused by forces, either internal, so that's linking to our biology, or external, that's linking to the environment, over which a person has no control. So here's the debate, because there is one side of the debate saying, actually, hold on, people do have free will and they can make choices, where the other side of the debate says, hold on a minute, everything has a cause, and it's that cause that will determine the type of the behavior that is going to take place. So this is what we're going to look at with free will versus determinism. So we'll start with free will. It's always good to start with one of them. Now, when it comes to free will, it is the idea that people have some degree of control and choice over their actions, which is not dictated by internal or external forces. So please note here, it's not always saying that we have complete free will, but we have some degree of control or choice over how we're going to behave. And this degree of control or this choice is not determined by our biology or the environment, but ourselves. Free will suggests that people are self-determining, even though there are biological and environmental factors that exert some influence over their behavior. So free will's not saying, hold on, don't agree that there's going to be influences on our behavior, but they don't see it as the cause of behavior. They believe that there are going to be biological environmental influences on our behavior, but it's initially down to whether we choose to go with them or choose a different type of behavior. So this implies that people are able to reject or ignore these influences or factors and override them by choosing how to behave. So let's think of an example. You've got a really bad headache and it feels like your head's going to explode. Now, that could be a cause of grumpy behavior. But you might decide, actually, you're still going to be quite pleasant when somebody talks to you. So you have that choice over that biological factor. So you can choose, do I just go feeling grumpy because my head is going to explode? So it's making you not feel well. Or are you just still going to be pleasant because that's how you decide? And that's what free will looks at. It looks at this idea that we do have a degree of control and choice over our actions. The humanistic approach, you could actually use this as a nice little AO3, linking in the approaches as an evaluation. The humanistic approach states that people have free will. Now, we've looked at that when we looked at the humanistic approach. They strongly believe in free will. So they state they can freely choose how they can bring about self-improvement and bring about positive change. So according to the humanistic approach, to self-actualize, it's all about the choices that we personally make, not the cause of a biological or environmental factor. But there's a nice little however here, because remember, the humanistic approach that we've looked at looks at how you can become the best person you could possibly be. But free will does conflict with some of the elements of the humanistic approach. The development of oneself is determined how others treat us. Hold on, there's an environmental factor. Because remember, it's about unconditional positive regard or conditional regard that we're getting from our parents. So let's look at the example here. The developing of a person into a fully functioning adult is dependent on how they are treated with unconditional positive regard. Suggesting that we do not have truly free will as others influence a person's ability to develop. Now, we can use this as we've got supporting evidence or support from the humanistic approach, and we've got a nice little evaluation here, but we can also bring this in if we did an essay on the humanistic approach as a nice evaluation there as well. It's really important that you can start to see the links between the different modules. But what this is saying, according to the humanistic approach, to be the best person you are is influenced by this idea of whether we receive unconditional positive regards by our parents or it is conditional. So that's an environmental factor that's going to cause our behavior. So really, it does challenge the idea of free will here. But free will is looking at the idea that as humans, we have some degree of control and choice over our behavior. Now, I want to bring this little section in here before we start looking at determinism, and that is science and psychology. Now, right at the beginning of year 12, I think it was in our first week, we started to look at the key features of science and how they apply to psychology. So we're going to be looking at this element here because psychology purports to be a science. It states that it is a science. So we need to understand this debate as well from a scientific perspective. So according to science, all behavior has a specific cause and all causes can be explained by general laws, which will link to a nomothetic approach. Now remember, when we looked at some of the key features of science, one of them was determinism. Now determinism states that all behavior is determined, so that means all behavior has a cause. And it's a key feature of science. So if it's a key feature of science, surely it should be the approach that we take in psychology. If we are doing objective research and we are identifying that the IV does affect the DV, so therefore cause and effect can be established, we can then use that research to support the theories that we're developing. And these theories that we develop are referred to as general laws because we want to apply them to everybody. And that's what we call a nomothetic perspective. When we look at ideographic and nomothetic debate, you'll start to understand that perspective in much more detail. Now, this is very important as it allows scientists to make predictions about and control events in the future. That's why it's really important that we can establish these causal relationships and these general laws so that we can make predictions and we can actually have some form of control on events to come. It's like, I know I've used this examples and before, it is psychologists that actually have laid out supermarkets. And if you set it this way, based on the research of you're going up one aisle and down the other and everything like that, we can predict how the majority of people are going to behave in the future and therefore prevent things like congestion or overcrowding within supermarkets or within football stadiums and the like. That is why doing controlled laboratory experiments allows psychologists to remove and control extraneous variables in order to formulate general laws, which will allow them to make predictions and control human behavior. So really, if psychology is claimed to be that science, it must take on this approach. And this key element of science is determinism, because determinism allows us to take an approach in which we're looking for a causal relationship, that there is something specific that causes that type of behavior. So we've got a nice link here. And again, we can turn this into an evaluation, because in order to support our general laws, we need to be able to establish these causal relationships. And just to reinforce, because when we look at science and also when we look at determinism, the key idea that every cause has a specific effect. And that's what it's all about, according to science. So that links us into this idea of determinism. So if psychology is claiming to be a science, now, I'd like you to pause here in a moment. Which approaches do you think agrees that psychology is a science and agrees with the deterministic viewpoint? Have a pause here, just quick on a piece of paper, jot down, what do you think? Think of the approaches that we've covered. Which of them want to include determinism, and which one meets the scientific method of determinism? Over to you, have a pause. Great, thank you for pausing, that's really good. Hopefully you've come up with, there is most probably one, or maybe two, but there's a contradiction, but one clear one that you would have seen that doesn't want to study humans from an objective manner, and that would have been the humanistic approach. Whereas all the other ones, behaviorist, biological, cognitive, psychodynamic to an effect, that one's a little bit different because it does use case studies. So it's based on a lot of subjectivity. However, so there is that argument, but however, it does believe that it's our unconscious mind that causes our behavior. So it does acknowledge determinism. So really, it is the only one that's arguing that we shouldn't be studied as objects, like in general science, is the humanistic approach. So let's get back to determinism. Determinism is the view that human behavior is controlled or shaped by internal or external factors. This means that there is a definite cause for all behavior. So again, what do we mean by internal? That's to do with our biology. External is to do with the environment. So this proposes that there is no place for free will in human behavior. So according to a deterministic viewpoint, there is no such thing as free will, because there is a specific cause that causes that behavior to occur. And that cause can either be internal or external. Now, please note, exam hint here. If you get a question to define determinism, 2 marks, start off telling what it is before you tell it what it isn't. Don't say it states that there's no place for free will. You're not defining what it is. Define what it is. If it was a 3 mark, again, then link in the idea of free will. But don't start. If you ever get something in general to do with a define type question, do not tell it what it isn't. Start off telling what it is. Really important that you do that. Now, one way that the issue of the conflict between determinism and free will has kind of been addressed is through the use of soft determinism and hard determinism. So these are 2 types of determinism, and it's in essence to alleviate some of the conflict, or to come to maybe in essence to some form of answer to the debate itself, free will versus determinism. And hard determinism and soft determinism have been used to perhaps help explain that. Hard determinism states that all behavior is causally determined and there is no such thing as free will. So if something takes a hard deterministic viewpoint, it will clearly say that there is no such thing as free will. So according to a hard deterministic point of view, free will doesn't exist. So there's no debate. And this takes on a pure scientific perspective because we want that causal relationship. And these causes are either internal or external. So things like our genes or conditioned behavior that we have. There is no such thing as free will. So really, from this perspective, there is no debate. So this can be regarded as a very fatalistic view and seen to be quite an extreme understanding of behavior. So quite fatalistic. You know, for example, I was born a female, so therefore I am going to be the nurturer. I'm the birth giver, so there's no choice. You're that way, so there's no choice. It's quite a fatalistic. It doesn't take in the idea of, actually, I don't choose to have any children. Or I don't choose to be the nurturer. My husband's going to stay at home and watch the kids. No, because the female is the nurturer because I'm biologically designed that way, where the man is not. So it is a very fatalistic viewpoint. On the other hand, soft determinism states that even though our actions are determined, it is not incompatible with free will. So what this means, it says, yes, our behavior is still determined, so it has a specific cause, but it acknowledges there's an element of free will in here. So that's what I mean by not incompatible. Actually, it can fit in with free will as well. So soft determinism sees a combination of both in the sense that behavior is determined, so there is a specific cause, but it's how we then choose our behavior that makes it soft deterministic. So a person's choices are determined by factors such as their genes or past conditioning, but they may opt to act in accordance with their choices, and this is free will. Going back to the example, right? According to hard determinism, my biology says I'm a female, I will the one that will give birth, I'm the one that nurtures. No choice. However, according to soft determinism, yes, I'm a female, I'm the one that's going to give birth to my children, but I may not decide to be the stay-at-home mum because my husband and I decided that he will be the stay-at-home dad, then I go off and have the career and my husband stays at home. Can you see that soft determinism does allow for free will to override some of the key elements of determinism? There's no choice. I have to give birth. I'm the female. Can't get out of that. I'm the one that's going to be pregnant. Men can't do that. Not yet anyway. Right. So we can clearly see the difference here. The cognitive approach is a prime example of soft determinism. It really is. Because what is the determining factor? If we just look at the most basic assumption here, that all our behavior is determined by our mental and our mediating processes. However, and here's the however, we may not choose to go along with those mental thoughts and then decide to act differently. So again, it's a prime example. There is a specific cause. However, we may choose not to go along with those mediating processes, those mental processes, and actually choose something quite different. So this is a nice way. Both of these are types of determinism, but this is a nice way actually to kind of look at the debate between free will and determinism. Hard determinism says there's no debate. That's it. There's no choice whatsoever. Where soft determinism actually says everything starts off with a specific cause. But From that cause, we can then start to make choices based on that cause. So let's look at some other types of determinism. We have biological determinism, and the clue's in the name, biological. So this links to the biological approach. The biological approach will be seen as being biologically deterministic. It emphasizes the role of the human biological makeup that accounts for behavior. This includes things like genes, hormones, our nervous system, neurotransmitter, our neural structure, etc., reproduction system. So really, it focuses as the cause of our behavior is fixed on this area. So research has shown that there are genetic causes for mental disorders. Remember when we did psychopathology, we looked at depression, we looked at OCD, and we looked at phobias, and it clearly had a genetic explanation for them. So a biological explanation for those behaviors. So again, those biological explanations, we could bring in biological determinism. However, in some cases, it cannot be seen as the sole cause, as it is argued that environmental influences has some influence on our biological structures. Now, this is what you can look at when it comes to our geno and our phenotype. When we do biopsychology, we are going to be looking a little bit more than in geno and phenotype, but we looked at that in the biological approach. Genotype is what we're born with. The phenotype is how our genes interact with the environment. So it cannot purely be said that it is purely biological. So in essence, it could be argued that the biological approach is doubly deterministic because it is determined on our biological makeup, but also how our biology interacts with the environment. So it's the environmental, so it's both internal and external causes. So actually, there's still no free will. So according to the biological approach, it doesn't acknowledge free will, but it does acknowledge that it's predominantly biologically determined, but it doesn't exclude that our environment is going to be some influence on our behavior. So again, just like I said, it's doubly determined or doubly deterministic. Environmental determinism. So this is happening in our environment. All behaviors is caused by the environment. So all behavior is caused by the environment. Can you think of which approach this could be? Which approach says that our behavior is determined in the environment in which we're in? Come on, have a think. We learn all our behavior from the environment. Shout it out, come on, I can hear you. I'm sure I can. Yeah, that's right. It's the behaviorist approach. This is really a type of determinism that we can apply to the behaviorist approach. How a person is conditioned to respond to a specific stimulus. So it's how we learn our behavior. Classical and operant conditioning, we have a stimulus and then we learn that response. It's the stimulus in the environment, we learn that response. It's through how that response is reinforced that we learn our behavior. Or if we're looking at social learning theory, it's how we observe other people's behavior, then we will have that element of how we learn, and then we'll replicate that behavior. A person may think that they are acting independently, but it is shaped by the interactions with the environment. For example, socialization is carried out by parents, teachers, etc., and how they reinforce your behaviors. You might think, well, actually, I chose to behave that way, but somewhere along in your conditioning, you could have learned that response. So really, it takes away this element of free will with regards to environmental determinism. There is a little link here, though. Social learning theory does take an element of, remember we had those mediating processes, whether the person feels that they can do it, it's that choice, or whether they're going to carry out that behavior. But on the other hand, it's whether you've learned that behavior, whether you can do it. So really, it's purely deterministic. You might kind of think, well, I'm choosing to act that way, But actually, you've learned how to behave that, or by watching and observing others and not intimidating, um, can't think of the word, my mind's gone there, but you're copying their behavior, definitely not intimidating, right? Their behavior, silly me. But you're watching them, and then you've learned how to behave. So maybe there is no free will. So there is that nice little debate there that you can bring about. Let's look at psychic determinism. And it states that all behavior is caused by the unconscious mind. And so therefore it links to the psychodynamic approach. Our psyche, all behavior stems from our unconscious mind. So in the unconscious mind, we have our conflicts, we have our repressed memories, we have traumatic childhood experience and everything. And all of this develops during childhood and as we're growing up. And because they're in our unconscious mind, because of this conflict, because of what's happening, this turmoil happening in there, it influences our behavior and who we are as adults. Freud believed that nothing occurred by chance. He actually says free will is just an illusion. We may think we have it, but we don't. He even identifies that, remember we learned about the paraplexies, the Freudian slip, the slip of the tongue? Like, I think I used the example in class, calling me mum rather than Mrs. Smith, right? And you kind of think, ooh, why did that come out? That is your unconscious mind. So Freud believed that nothing occurred by chance, even paraplexies. These are seen as revealing the unconscious influence on our behavior. So according to the psychodynamic approach, there is no free will. And it's all influenced by the conflict between our ego and superego. It could be repressed memories, traumatic experience, or what other conflict that's happening within there that causes us to behave as adults. So we've looked at a good few. We've looked at psychic, environmental, and biological, soft and hard determinism. We've looked at the idea of determinism being a part of science, and we've looked at the concept of free will. So we want to look at, just quickly, briefly, you can develop them in your notes, arguments for and against determinism. Really important that you know arguments for and against, because that's what you're discussing. Because if you're discussing the debate, you've got to look for those arguments for and against. The nice thing, and we've pulled it in, determinism is consistent with the aims of science. It's a key feature of science that allows us to establish causality. So I'm not going into that any further. We've looked at it previous. The nice thing about this scientific view and establishing these causal relationships is that we can develop practical applications, things like development of treatments and therapies. We would never have got drug therapies, taking certain type, develop those drugs or has certain type of therapies to help treat if we couldn't establish, hold on, it is the serotonin levels that are too low that could be linked to depression. So if we can then develop, so we've got that causality, so low levels of serotonin account for depression, we can then develop a drug to increase the levels of serotonin. So a lot of practical applications, so really good. Arguments against, just look at the one, it's incompatible with our legal system. Hard determinism states that we have no choice. So if you committed a crime, according to hard determinism, you had no control over it. It was either environmentally or internally determined, and you had no choice. So really, there's no accountability on your side. So you can't be tried. So it takes away the accountability for our actions. Whereas, hold on, soft determinism actually states, yes, we may have environmental factors that may put us in the direction of being more criminal. However, we do have that choice. So again, there is arguments about it's not incompatible. The moral argument as well. If it's carrying out an act and you say, well, I had a biological gene, or I've got a gene that makes me more aggressive, it's not my fault. so I can't be prosecuted. So yeah, we've got an argument against. So let's look at arguments for and against free will. For, there is face validity. On face validity, on the surface, it looks valid. And that's a nice thing for free will. On the surface, it does look like we have free will. And because it does look like we have free will and people do experience choice, then it looks like free will exists. So we've got that argument in favor. Research suggests that those with an internal locus of control believe they influence over their on life events. So we do have research that shows that perhaps a person who has an internal locus of control will be less conforming in certain situations and less obedient in certain situations because they feel that they take responsibility for their actions. So again, that does support the idea that free will does exist. Against, neurologically, our thoughts are determined before we consciously are aware of making the decision. When you look in your textbook, there is research that looks at the idea of so many seconds. Let me just quickly find it. Sun et al. Demonstrated that brain activity that determined the outcome of simple choices may predate our knowledge of making such a choice. So actually, our brain is making the choice before we consciously become aware of it. So really, maybe there's no free will. That choice that we've decided to make was actually already determined by our brain activity and before we consciously became aware of it. So here we've got this nice debate of free will versus determinism. An extension task that you can do is go back to your approaches and actually fill in, because they can be used as good AO3s. For example, the psychodynamic approach, link in psychic determinism. Look at the cognitive approach, bring in self-determinism. Look at the biological approach, it's hard determinism, but also biological determinism. So link them in, because actually these debates can become good evaluations in your approaches module. So it's a good way to become familiar with the AO1, but also turn your AO1 into an AO3 in other areas, and that will help minimize the amount of evaluations that you will need for the exams. Right, on that happy note, my lovelies, remember, work through the textbook, work through the video, pause as you go along, make your notes, and remember, if you have any questions, email me. Take care.